My name is Kim Bailey, and I'm with Alzheimer's Orange County. And welcome to the first in this series of three of training for professionals serving individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. These sessions, just a couple of acknowledgments before we get underway. The curriculum itself, the material in the training that you'll be participating in comes from NTG, which is the National Task Group on Intellectual Disabilities and Dementia Practices, which is a consortium group of subject matter experts from around the nation who have been around for a number of years, and they're dedicated to education, support, and training of this type. So we certainly hope that you'll enjoy it and get lots of good new information from the sessions. Also, this project is supported through a grant collaboration. The funding was provided through the Administration for Community Living and was awarded to OMAID, Multicultural Institute for Development, and in collaboration with Alzheimer's Orange County. I've been with Alzheimer's Orange County for a long time. A little bit about my background. I'm a gerontologist, which means I have expertise in aging issues and also a specialization in Alzheimer's disease. And I've been working in the field for about 30 years. I'm very, very pleased to be with you today. So before we start talking about Alzheimer's disease, let me go over the course objectives. We want to start with aging, just aging in and of itself, because it's a relatively new phenomenon in the IDD world. So we want to understand it as a lifespan approach, and I'll explain what that means. We want to talk about aging then and now for persons living with intellectual and developmental disabilities. I want to talk about the intersection of lifestyle factors with aging and how in the past lifestyle caused problems for those who then began to live into later life. So I'll explain all that as we go along. But first of all, let's just focus on aging a little bit, because it isn't something that just happens in the last part of life. I know that's how we're all used to thinking of it, but it's a unique process for every individual. And I know it's hard for young people to think of it in this way, but it's something that is an active process that starts on the day of our birth and continues from birth until death. And there are a lot of variables that impact how we age. And it starts with genetics, which is something that we can't influence, but also lifestyle. Each individual's lifestyle plays a huge role in how we're going to age, as does the environment we're raised in and society around us, society's attitudes towards us, stigma, discrimination, all of those things sort of bundle together to determine our outcomes in aging. So that's true for all of us on this webinar, and it's especially true for individuals living with IDD. So start to think about that in terms not only of yourself, but especially today for your clients. And we were going to go on a little history lesson today, not because I'm especially fond of living in the past, but I want all of you to understand where a lot of our older clients today came from and what impact that's had on their aging process today. So, you know, again, when you think of aging from the perspective of the lifespan approach, it's sort of based around this concept that, you know, whatever happens in your youth and your young adulthood is going to affect your quality of life in late life. And so your habits and lifestyle, your environment, all those things I just mentioned are going to play an important role. And while it's never too late to make a difference, the earlier we start, the larger difference we can make. And so for all of us, some healthy lifestyle changes can include the 4 things that you see on this slide: diet, exercise and physical health, cognitive stimulation, and social engagement. We sort of call those things the 4 pillars of healthy aging. Now think for a moment what that's looked like for our clients since birth. Do we think that all of our clients have necessarily had the right kind of diet all along? Do we think that they've had the right kind of exercise and physical health? Do we think they've had the right kind of cognitive stimulation and social engagement? Or do we think maybe there's been some strikes against them, some factors that have been against them, maybe from the start? What do you think? Well, historically, there's been a lot of barriers and there's been a lot of challenges. Consider, if you will, that, I mean, we're talking about aging and it didn't even really used to exist for the typical Down syndrome individuals. Today, the average lifespan of a person with Down syndrome is, right around 60 years of age. But you consider that in the year 1960, it was about 10 or 12 years of age. Did you know that? And that was not that long ago. So people did not live very long with Down syndrome. So I think by 1983, it had grown to about age 25. And then by 2007, on average, people with Down syndrome were living into their 40s. And the life expectancy was, I believe, or the lifespan, no, I think it was expectancy was about 47. So you can see how much progress has been made, and people are now living, as I said, into their 60s with Down syndrome. So aging on the whole is sort of a whole new, ball of wax for families and also for providers. So if you stop and think about what that's like for families, what they need to learn, what challenges they've had in caring for individuals over, what are increasing years, maybe they would have gone back and done some things differently, and maybe our system would have been set up much differently to accommodate. But what do you think it was set up for back then in 1960 or before that? And what do you think life was like for individuals then? So, we were talking about things like exercise and cognitive stimulation and socialization. Those are things that predict health in old age. Well, I don't think there was any of that going on for people living with Down syndrome and many other uh, intellectual and physical disabilities. So, and there was so much stigma and so much isolation. So, let me give you an example. This is a family that I worked with. I've actually had a support group for caregivers of individuals living with Down syndrome for about over 5 years now, more like 8 years. And an elderly couple actually told us the story of their daughter Ruth. So this is Ruthie, was what they always called her. She was born in 1956 with Down syndrome. And the doctor said, well, she's probably not going to live and you just need to institutionalize her. And that was often the case in those days. And Ruthie's parents were in the military and kind of moving around, long-term military, kind of moving around from base to base. There was no help there from the military. There was a huge amount of discrimination and stigma going on. I mean, really, back in those days, they just shut people away and waited for them to die. And you're probably aware that individuals with Down syndrome are often born with many physical uh, issues that need to be dealt with surgeries and procedures. And generally speaking, back in the day, none of that was done. And it could be said that these babies just didn't thrive, and nor were they given the opportunity to. There was no funding for families or individuals with these issues. There were no community groups, no regional center, no vendors, you know, just no parent groups. And so Ruthie's mother became an incredible advocate and supporter. And everywhere she went, from base to base, she made inquiries and found other families and started groups and began writing having letter writing campaigns, and just became this wonderful advocate for her daughter and for other families. And not only did Ruthie live past 10, she went on to live a very healthy and happy life, and was a joy to her parents and to her siblings. Um, so they did have her in a group home eventually, where her, she was a joy to all of the direct care staff, and they became her second family. But her parents brought her home every single weekend for years and years and years, until they were simply too elderly and infirm themselves to care for her. But she was always included in all the family activities and just had a beautiful life. And you can see from all the pictures that she lived into old age. Unfortunately, as many folks with Down syndrome do, she developed Alzheimer's disease when she was in her 50s. And as I said, Ruthie's parents attended our Alzheimer's Orange County support group, and Ruthie was a longtime research participant in the UCI MIND Down Syndrome Program, and we'll give you information about that if you're interested. She ultimately donated her brain upon her passing away, helping to further the research into finding the cause and hopefully the cure someday for Alzheimer's disease in persons living with Alzheimer's disease and Down syndrome. And so this is a great example, I think, to sort of bring to light the fact that we've gone in recent decades from having people live, from, they started just dying at age 10, now they're living into old age, but the problem is they experience premature aging, and they are at this high risk for Alzheimer's disease. So it's kind of a good news and bad news story when it comes to Down syndrome and Alzheimer's disease. And so let's talk about some of the other things that sort of set the wheels in motion in terms of historically some of the practices that came into play at that time. So typically there were just some very poor lifespan health practices, and just other factors like stigma and keeping people segregated and isolated, poor socialization for these folks. I know that as I mentioned, I've been a gerontologist for about 30 years. When I was younger, before I worked with older adults, I had the privilege of working in special education for a few years. And it was before children were mainstreamed in the public school system. And I often thought about how segregated they were, but at least those were, at least they had the public school education, and legislation by that time had been passed to ensure that they were entitled to that. But I still lamented the fact that they were segregated from the general population. So socialization is needed, and all that interaction that goes on now, I think, is very helpful. uh, Integrating into the community, and having the same opportunities as the typical population, the general population has. Um, I know that things are even worse in other countries, places abroad. In one classroom I worked, I remember we had one student who was actually smuggled here from a Mideastern country. The family was so terrified of what might happen to their son with an intellectual and developmental disability in his home country, that they smuggled him out of the country so that he could receive the right civil rights and liberties here in the United States. And so saw examples of that as well. And also, back in those earlier decades that we are talking about here, to kind of set a framework for our whole discussion, there were some inappropriate medications given. People were over medicated, sort of as a general rule, and there were some long term side effects and consequences of that over medication. That prolonged use of medications just added to chronic conditions that individuals later suffered in older age. And really, they were on psychotropic medications that they didn't need. In addition, and you can sort of look at this graphic here. There were a variety of things that sort of came together just to create like the perfect storm. People have age-associated comorbidities. I mentioned briefly, children, particularly with Down syndrome, often have heart defects, cardiovascular issues. They tend toward obesity. They have GI issues, stomach, digestive issues. They often have sleep apnea. Many are diagnosed with hyperthyroidism. There were early problems with accessing the right health services. Some were non-existent. Many physicians, unfortunately, did not know how to treat their issues. They weren't familiar with working with children with IDD. And then those lifestyle factors that I was talking about earlier that are so important to all of us, making sure we have lots of good physical exercise, fresh air, walking, just being out and about, doing things, socializing, all of those things sort of play a role in the obesity and, diet, poor eating habits. So we've seen a lot of that play itself out in our clients, haven't we? A lot of whom, many of whom are overweight and want sweets all the time, etc. And so some of these things we can are beyond our control, and some of them we can help with. So sort of think about how all of these factors kind of swirled into the perfect storm, as I said, for many of our clients early on, and impacted the way they are now as they reach old age. And let me remind you again, our clients prematurely age. And so we may think of being older in the general population. I don't know, it's kind of hard to define old, isn't it? But we think of elderly as like people in their 80s. Um, you know, I'm I'm going to officially be a senior this year myself, so I'm turning 65. So for people with IDD, 40s, 50s, 60s, those are our aged population. And so all of these things are going to be factors in how well they age. So, in fact, what I've done here is paint a picture and set a stage for why a lot of our clients have problems with the aging process. And then just a few other notes on this is that as they've aged, they've seen a lot of turnover in staff and even their family caregivers, because when you think about it, many of them have, lost their family caregivers. So when you have, a 50 or 60-year-old client, their parents may have passed away and now a sibling may have assumed the role of family caregiver, or they may be in placement, or they may have experienced different workers in their day settings. And so maybe their their medical history has sort of gotten lost along the way, or it's incomplete, or maybe their younger years weren't even recorded. So we're not always sure what their baseline functioning was like. And so that makes a difference, especially when we're seeing changes. Like Dr. T was saying, she's seeing some changes in behavior, some of the clients. It's always helpful to know what their baseline functioning was. We don't always have those records. And then, of course, there's a lack of overall training and expertise in this arena. And so then as we add dementia and Alzheimer's disease into that equation, it becomes even more problematic. But all is not lost. Here we are, we're doing great training today, and you're gonna have more sessions, and your clients are in wonderful hands with all of you, because I know that you're already doing a great job. And so more training is just icing on the cake, right? So just to finish up this piece, and then we'll move on and talk about Alzheimer's disease itself. We know that historical treatment led to poor outcomes, but things are changing now. Better understanding, increased programs, and opportunity are leading to a much higher quality of life now. The other good news is that lifespans have increased dramatically for people living with IDD over the past few decades. And that sort of goes hand in hand with the general population. And so people are getting the treatments they need, hopefully changing, not only changing medical care, but changing lifestyle is helping to make that difference. But we do have to be aware that, individuals with Down syndrome in particular experience premature aging. And even though they're living well into their 60s, depending on, their other health conditions, we have to know that the risk for Alzheimer's dramatically increases as they age. And that's what we're going to talk about next. All right, so in this next section, we are going to learn about Alzheimer's and dementia. We're going to see how common it is in the umbrella IDD community, but we're going to really focus on people living with Down syndrome because they're at the highest risk. We're going to talk about the early symptoms and what those symptoms look like in clients living with Down syndrome. And we'll talk a little bit about how it progresses. So you may be confused about terms. Most people are, they say, well, what's the difference between Alzheimer's and dementia? So, the best way to describe it is that dementia is a broad term. It really describes a whole bunch of different progressive degenerative brain impairments, all of which affect memory and thinking and judgment and the ability to perform ADLs. And they typically affect people in late life. So it's not really a disease in and of itself. It's more of a group of symptoms. And so if you think of it as an umbrella term, and I'm going to show you a slide in a minute that's got umbrellas, just to remember, if it's an umbrella, under that umbrella, the most common type of dementia is Alzheimer's disease, and it makes up most of the cases. And really, Alzheimer's is what we see as being most prevalent in the general population and in the IDD population. And so, and the thing to remember in both the general population and in the IDD population is that there's no single, that's not a word. There's no single definitive test for it. So you can't just give someone a blood test to see if they have it or not. You have to rule out any other cause for it. And there are a lot of different things that can, look like dementia. So here's, sort of the umbrella that I was talking about. On the left side, you see Alzheimer's disease and the different types of dementia. And it's kind of like the IDD world. You see, there's so many different types of disorders that fall under the IDD umbrella, right? But because, again, because people with Down syndrome are at the highest risk, we're kind of focusing there. And because Alzheimer's is #1 in the dementia world, we're kind of focusing there. So the Alzheimer's and the other major types of dementia are irreversible. So you can't, there's nothing that can cure it. We don't even have anything that can, really slow it down. Once it starts, it's a type of brain damage. It involves two proteins. One is called amyloid and one is called tau. And these are substances that begin to manifest themselves in the brain. The amyloid forms plaques around the brain cells, and the tau protein forms fibrous growths inside the cell bodies. And so the interesting thing, and this is sort of gets to the relationship between Alzheimer's and Down syndrome, is that, in Down syndrome, that extra copy of chromosome 21 is the reason for the correlation, because it is where the amyloid is produced. That's what leads to extra production of and buildup of amyloid with aging in the brains of people with Down syndrome. That extra copy is what produces that extra amyloid. And so amyloid is a protein that we all have in our brains, but Alzheimer's for some reason causes excessive extra buildup of it into these plaques. And so it's just, this damage starts to grow in the brain, and every single person, 100% of people with Down syndrome, are found upon autopsy to have amyloid plaques and the tangles in their brains. However, and I want to really put a strong point to this statement, not every single person with Down syndrome will develop Alzheimer's disease, but they are at a very high risk for it. Okay. Before we go any further into that, I want us to look together at the reversible kind of fake dementias, if you will. We call them pseudo dementias. So you can have people that are looking and acting like they may have some type of dementia, like Alzheimer's disease. Sometimes, particularly in the general population, we have older adults, and maybe not so old, that are experiencing untreated, unchecked depression, for example, that may present as having a dementia. And when it's diagnosed and treated, their symptoms go away. They may be on the wrong medications, or they may be having a reaction to medications. They may have severe nutritional deficiencies, like a really out of whack potassium deficit or B12 shortage, or I don't know, just something really severely imbalanced. They might have infections, severe infections that have not been treated, that have gone into like a delirium that looks like dementia. They could have thyroid disease. This list is very long, and we're only seeing, just a few of the standout, a few of the major things. So a good workup for dementia needs to be done, an evaluation, and that can be obtained in a number of places. But for Down syndrome, it can be done here at UC Irvine at the Down Syndrome Clinic, which is a nationally and state funded, it's a federally funded research center dedicated to evaluating dementia in Down syndrome, individuals living with Down syndrome, and they're devoted to research into the cause and cure for Alzheimer's disease. So we have a great resource here in our community, and we have had a long-standing partnership with them, and it's at UCI MIND, and there's information in your handouts about that. Okay. So I think I covered that. Again, focusing on Alzheimer's because it's the most common form of dementia. It has somewhat of a gradual onset, especially in the general population. I'll say in all populations. It's hard to pinpoint when it starts, but we do note that people are unable to remember new information. They're still, in the beginning, hanging on to old skills and old information, but you start to notice this changes in their daily activities. What's happening in the brain is that damage is starting, and we're starting to see healthy cells die, which leads to brain atrophy, and atrophy is just a fancy word for shrinkage, due to the plaques and tangles that I talked about. And you can see those plaques, those clumps in between the nerve cells, the brain cells in the picture here. And in this next slide, you're going to see sections of the brain, the healthy brain compared to advanced Alzheimer's. You see the great difference in size and weight of this Down syndrome brain. These two brains, it's just a side-by-side comparison to show you how much is lost in this illness, unfortunately, sadly. Okay, so how common is it? So in the population, in the IDD population, it's not that different than the general population. The exception is Down syndrome, as I've said several times. And remember too that IDD population has premature aging. So in about 3% of those over the age of 40 have dementia, usually Alzheimer's. And then it goes up. It's going to go up as people age to 6% of those over the age of 60. Whoops, I'm sorry. And then 80 plus, which is really very old for the IDD population, you'll see it affecting 12%. So that's not so bad. Look at the percentages, compare that to the Down syndrome population, where we're seeing by age 40 plus, about 22% of those living with Down syndrome have Alzheimer's disease. And then 60 plus, and remember that 60 is pretty much, that's life expectancy for Down syndrome, 56%. And it used to be, I think, even higher than that. So over half. Okay. All right, so what does it look like in the beginning? So sadly, we see changes in personality, and everybody is so different. And so I'm going to make a generalization here. And generally, we know our folks living with Down syndrome are generally very happy, eager to please, very loving people. And so it's very hard for staff and families to see these behavioral changes. So that can be a pretty big red flag for Alzheimer's when you start to see irritability, people being stubborn and not wanting to cooperate, and even getting aggressive when they never were like that before. That's a big red flag and a sign. And then maybe increased agitation, noisiness, or just, getting very excited, not in necessarily a good way. This is an important sign to watch for. Early onset seizures when they were not present before. New seizure activity. That is to say that's beginning in adulthood. Changes in gait. So they're having trouble now with walking, or they're not as coordinated as they once were. Less social. So again, this is a big change for a lot of our folks who always want to be out and with friends and doing things and going to Disneyland, or, going to the fair, going to work. They love their jobs and being with people. And now we're seeing withdrawal, the families saying, or the group home operators saying they don't want to go. This is a big sign. Just decreased enthusiasm for usual activities, difficulty with communicating, not, being able to express themselves quite the way they did before. Less focus or decreased ability to pay attention, sad or fearful, increase in anxiety, restlessness, or interruption in their usual sleep cycle is another sign. So these are all, sort of early signs in individuals. So kind of watch for these things like change in ADLs, change in gait, and the seizures, and as well as the other things that we just talked about. Yeah. And other things as well. Maybe they become incontinent, or they're gradually becoming incontinent. They could have some short-term memory. It sort of depends on what demands are being made on their memory and how much they have to rely on it in everyday life. And it's sort of hard to measure right now because of the pandemic. It's really hard to measure now because a lot of them have not been able to work for the last year. They haven't been able to be in your programs. They've been kind of isolated and withdrawn, because of the virus. So they may be experiencing a lot of slippage. It's a slippery slope for those that are in the risk group for dementia, sadly. So we've been seeing a lot of decline. So for some of you that are welcoming back your clients after a long absence, you may see some big changes. I hope I'm wrong. But sort of the timing of this training, I think, is good in terms of that. So know that just as it is in the general population, the course of this illness and the way the symptoms evolve is unpredictable, and it's different for each individual. But you should know that the course of the disease is shorter in the Down syndrome population compared with the general population. So in the general population, this disease can run anywhere from 3 to 20 years. but we will commonly see people living like 10 to 12 years with it. And unfortunately, not so in the Down syndrome population. We will typically see about 5 years. And it does move faster, obviously. So you'll see problems continue with language and with the ability to walk and navigate, etc. So we'll talk more about that. And thanks again for tuning in.